Good evening. I'm Nayyera Haq, and welcome to the Lincoln Report. Tonight, as the second impeachment of Donald Trump moves forward in the Senate, we look more broadly at the Republican Party, its history, where it is now, and what its future might be. That's what you can expect from us here at the Lincoln Report. Clarity, context, and help deciphering the chaotic world around us. Now, what you can expect from me, well, I'm a progressive, a woman of color, a Muslim, and a mom. I've called people like Speaker Pelosi and President Obama boss. I've worked to elect Democrats and bring their policies to life for my entire career. Now, working with the Lincoln Project isn't the most obvious choice for me. However, over the last 5 years, many of us have united to oppose the dangers of Trump and Trumpism, of authoritarianism, nationalism. So I'm here with you and for you, working to renew the promise of America, to propel our country forward, to hold our leaders accountable, and to rebound from this dark moment in our country's history. For real change to happen, we can't afford to be complacent. Each of us must work to make what comes next better. And we need your help. So join this conversation. Tweet us at the hashtag #AskTheLincolnReport. Help us hold each other and the people in power accountable. What questions do you want our expert guests to answer? What topics do you want us to dive into? We're glad you're along for the ride. So let's get started. Here at the Lincoln Report, we've had some lively discussions about the current crop of Republican Congress members, from senators whispering their convictions behind closed doors, who are too scared to take a stand in public, to the representatives who just can't seem to stop speaking their minds. You know who we're talking about. Those who harass victims of mass shootings, who traffic in conspiracies, who continue to deny the simple effectiveness of wearing masks to prevent the spread of a deadly virus. Now, I don't want to spend our time highlighting specific wackadoodle ideas. Instead, we want to look beyond the crazy caucus and toward what their elevated profiles tell us about the current state of the GOP. A party that, despite its pearl clutching, appears to only care about power. Where better to start than Donald Trump's second impeachment? Interesting choice to do a sequel without the lead. Now, Donald Trump is absent, but his presence still looms large. The prosecution has videos, data, compelling arguments, and a cape-wearing Avenger. That's Stacey Plaskett of the U.S. Virgin Islands, by the way. And defense has poorly cut suits, Republicans scrambling to spin a lack of coherence. And a CBS News poll shows that a majority of Americans would like to see the Senate convict. However, according to the same poll, 71% of Republicans would view votes to convict as being disloyal to the party. So to help us make sense of this, I'm going to bring in our first guest. He's the rare Politico who has worked for both Republicans and Democrats. He was a chief strategist for the Bush-Cheney campaign in 2004 and a former chief political analyst at ABC News. He's the founder of Country Over Party. Welcome, Matthew Dowd.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Matthew, so glad you can join us. Oh, of course. Listen, I want to start with this clip of Senator Bill Cassidy.
Now, if I'm an impartial juror and one side's doing a great job and the other side's doing a terrible job on the issue at hand, as an impartial juror, I'm going to vote for the side that did the good job.
All right. So, Matthew, is Cassidy the outlier, or can we expect that other Republicans will follow suit?
I think even if some other Republicans follow suit, Cassidy will still be the outlier. I don't expect many to follow, though. If anybody watched, and I ask all the viewers if they have the time and to watch the hearings, because they're incredibly compelling. Especially today's hearings were incredibly compelling. If they didn't have R's on their backs or walk around in red suits, everybody knows what the result of this would be, which would be convict Donald Trump. But I think Cassidy's change in his vote when he said it is constitutional to hold this in the Senate was a good sign. I don't think it's a sign of a bunch of other people running to the same side as him.
So is that the problem, that in the Senate, the impartial jury isn't actually impartial, right? We've got Lindsey Graham already guaranteeing acquittal. So where does that, and actually this is, let me quote him, quote, "I reinforced to the president today that the case is over. It's just a matter of getting the final verdict now." Now, I'm assuming the president he's referring to is Trump, because right now in America, it's President Biden. But where does this blind loyalty come from? And how, can it be remedied?
Well, part of the problem in our politics today is there's too much blind loyalty that has existed. People just line up. They figure out what side the party's supposed to be on, and then they move in that direction to a large degree. But the Republicans have taken it to a whole new level over the course of the last 4 years, even when they know deep down it's not the right thing. It's not the constitutional thing. It's not the principled thing. And it's even funny to say it's not even in their best political interest broadly. They just follow right suit. Maybe maybe a Mitt Romney breaks at times, or a Susan Collins every now and then, or a Lisa Murkowski every now and then. But it's become sort of the standard thing for the Republican Party. And I think the problem is not so much Donald Trump, though he's the proximate issue. He's a proxy for a bigger problem, which is the Republican Party voters. Who the people are afraid of, the Republican officials are afraid of, is not fundamentally Donald Trump. He just represents the Republican voters who have adapted as many of the outlandish, crazy conspiracy things that Donald Trump pushed. So it's a party filled with millions of people, a minority of the country, but millions of people that they're afraid of. They don't want to be victimized in a primary, and because they lack the courage to stand up and do the right thing, and they want to hold office still, and power becomes more important than principle. That's the problem. They are just responsive to their voters, and they actually make their voters worse by not telling them the truth.
When you talk about power, there are several Republicans in the Senate who are actually not running for re-election. Richard Burr from North Carolina, Richard Shelby from Alabama, Rob Portman for Ohio. So shouldn't it be a no-brainer for them to do the right thing?
You would think, but I think they look at this as not only holding power, but in the halls of power and in circulation around whatever ridiculous parties somebody wants to go to, or the conversations they have in some place at the golf club or whatever it is. And I think they don't want to fall out of line. They think they'll be attacked, as you, I'm sure, fully aware and have experienced in the problems of the attacks on social media. They're just afraid. And one of the things I thought of while I was watching the hearings today, or watching the trial today, was, as they showed the Capitol Police being beaten and standing in the way, and obviously some being killed and some being permanently injured and all of that, these are people that had no vested interest in it, but were willing to risk their life for others. We now have Republican officials who not only are we not asking them to risk their life, all we're asking them is to suffer some political downside. They don't even have the courage, let alone a Capitol Police person. They don't even have the courage to suffer politically in this. And they don't even have the courage, if they're not running, to suffer being chastised by a group of people that I would think they wouldn't have respect for if they believe the kind of crazy stuff they believe. But that's where we are in this time, where this small group of people is just unwilling to show any sense of courage. I was thinking, as your lead in, as you were talking about as I call them, the granola caucus in the GOP, which is fruits, flakes, and nuts. I was thinking about it's a Wizard of Oz thing, where they not only need a lion of courage and a scarecrow of a brain, but they need a tin man of a heart. They need all three. So there's elected officials without empathy, without thinking, and without the courage to do what's right.
I want to talk about fear for a moment and then get to heart, since you mentioned that. How
Great.
Are the members of Congress who are afraid for their lives supposed to work with people who fundamentally deny that anyone was in danger, right? They're willing to sacrifice their colleagues' safety for their own power. And I think that's something that extends on a day-to-day level, too, of how we're supposed to interact with people who are willing to take people, say, who look like me or my family, and put them at risk for their own voting power.
Well, I think you raise a great point, which is why this ought to be broadened into a larger discussion about where we are today. First of all, I don't think the purpose, the rationale and the real purpose of this trial is about the punishment Donald Trump's going to get. While important, to me, it's the last stage of the process and the least important part of the process. The most important process is if we're going to have unity in this country, and if we're going to come together, whatever your political affiliation is, or whatever your demographic background is, we have to have some level of truth and accountability. We have to have it. And those times in our country's history, and you may have heard me say this before or read this, where we have not done that, and there's one real time where we didn't do it, we suffered, and we still suffer from the lasting legacy of that. And that was in the Civil War, when we were supposed to have Reconstruction, when we didn't fundamentally get one side and admit the truth and suffer full length of accountability for that. It led us on a path when then Reconstruction ended, not long after Abraham Lincoln was killed and his vision was stopped. It took us 100 years before we got voting rights and civil rights in our country. And I've said that the line of not having truth and not having accountability, it stretches from the end of Reconstruction through the death of Emmett Till, through the death of Medgar Evers, to the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, through the death of Martin Luther King, through the death of Heather Heyer, through the death of people killed by unjust police shootings. And to me, it goes back to the fundamental thing is there is a segment of our population that since the Civil War and probably before, that does not believe in the fundamental truth of our country, which is all men and women are created equal. And I still think we're fighting that battle today. And so in my view, unless we're willing to sort of have this trial and expose truth and accountability and understand that at the basis of much of what's going on here, the response to Donald Trump, the response of Republicans, is really a fundamental thing about their unwillingness to accept people in this country that don't look like them, that have a different set of religious beliefs than them, as fully equal. And they're not, quote unquote, as they often say, the real America. And until we get to that conversation and until we really examine that, we're going to have a real hard time in this country unifying and reconciling, because if people in this country do not feel like they have the same rights as others and the same opportunity as other people, and they're looked at differently as other people, and we now have almost an entire political party that is still captured in the idea there's real Americans and there's other Americans, then we'll never solve this problem. And I only say is this trial is one step towards finding out truth and accountability in this, long before we get to a punishment.
Many of the people that you talk about love to quote MLK out of context. And that seems to be the thing to do. It's one of my pet peeves, actually, is taking quotes out of the context of the history of the time and the history of the person. Lincoln, the namesake of not just the show, but also the people who put the show together, has the speech, "The House Divided." And in it, he said, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." So this speech wasn't just a generic call for unity that many are interpreting it as now. It was a very specific conclusion that our country had to choose slave or free. Is this another moment of choosing based on your theory of the failures of Reconstruction?
It's absolutely, in my view, a key moment of choosing. It is an absolutely key moment of choosing, not only just from a political position of where does the Republican Party go from here and what happens to it, but more fundamentally a moment of choosing for America. It is a real moment of choosing. And I'll also refer back to the other words of Lincoln years before that speech, on the House Divided speech, where he basically says, we'll never fall. A foreign power will never cause us to fall. It will be, the problem will come from within. And I think he understood years before the Civil War that part of what we have in America is this idea that there are certain people in our country that, quote, should have power, and certain people that shouldn't have power. And I think, Abraham Lincoln understood that long before that really fundamentally Americans are the greatest enemy to Americans. And until we live up to, which we've never done, as you know full well, and I'm sure have experienced, we have never lived up fully to the words in the Declaration of the Independence and the words in the US Constitution. And this is a fight and a battle. I mean, think about this. It took until 1919 before women had the constitutional right to vote. We passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 1890s. Everything we've done. Look what Muslims in this country have faced for the last 10 or 20 years in the face of this country, and their pushback in this, well, America, quote unquote, is a Christian country, and you're supposed to take the oath on the Bible and not the Quran. All of that is a fundamental problem that until we resolve that we're a multi-ethnic, diverse democracy, until people accept that is who we are, we have to become that. We can't be split between two parts that say, well, no, this is the one part, and let's all get along in the separate parts. And unless we come to a conclusion that that's what we are, we're going to be fighting this battle day in and day out for years to come.
We've heard many explanations, whether there be from observers or authors or even journalists. There's a piece in the Washington Post today actually talking about the economic background and the financial failures of people who attack the Capitol. And it seems to come under a discussion about economic anxiety, when what you've talked about is white rage. So why is that excused away by so many sectors of society?
Because I think so many families and people don't want to confront this very hurtful truth about ourselves. I wrote in USA Today this week about my own experience in my own family, growing up in Detroit and moving in the midst of the Detroit riots, and then the school busing issues, and all the things I heard in my own home from my mother and father, who were working class, Irish Catholics. That was all very prejudicial and negative towards African Americans. And that experience has happened in many families around this country and on many different issues. And I think it's very hard for people to confront that America isn't perfect. We weren't perfect at the start. We weren't perfect 10 years ago, and we're not perfect today. And I think it's very hard for people. So what they do is they find some other, instead of confronting that real fundamental problem that will actually cause us to look at our hearts and souls, they then come up with this thing well, people are suffering, it's an economic thing. And I don't think you can really separate economics from race, from all those other issues. Economics is all part of that, and it should be part of the conversation. But look at the people that showed up the Capitol. And it's funny to me is white Christian men in this country represent less than 30% of the country. They represent 85% of the positions of power in our country. And all the diversity and inclusion that we could possibly do is not going to get it down to 30%. There's people in this country that it's not that they're afraid they're going to get to only 30% of the power. They're afraid they're going to get dripped down to 70% of the power in the positions and the opportunities in this country. But I think it really goes back to there are many families. It's not a Southern problem. It's a problem everywhere. It's a problem as much in Birmingham, Alabama, as it is in Birmingham, Michigan. And until we face that and see that and understand that in our own families and look at our own biases and look at our own prejudices and understand how we arrive at this today, we have to look at our souls in this and finally admit to ourselves that America isn't perfect and we've done a lot of bad things. We can do a lot of great things, a lot of wonderful things. But we've done a lot of bad things and treated a lot of people wrong in the history of our country.
Well, and that's what I like to talk about, Matthew, is the promise of America and realizing that. And I really want to thank you for making it personal, because it is personal for all of us right now as we watch what's happening to our country. But before I let you go, I do want to take some questions from Twitter, get our listeners and viewers engaged on this. So waiting for a tweet to come up and see if we've got anything. Folks, if you do want to chime in on the conversation, just tweet us at the hashtag Ask the Lincoln Report. All right, here we go. From Marie Mason, sorry if I got that wrong. Today's video of insurrectionists chanting, "Destroy the GOP," should have been shocking to Republican senators. Do you think they will be moved by that visual to convict? What do they fear most, Trump or their party's imminent destruction? Matt, it is shocking, actually, Matt, that this was against the very Republicans who are actively ignoring the proceedings.
Yeah, and for somebody that they all applauded and praised, Mike Pence, they wanted to hang him, and they built a lynching structure outside the Capitol in order to go Mike Pence, who is probably the most obsequious, loyal person around Donald Trump. I don't think it's going to move many. I think it might move a couple. So you might get to 60 votes in the Senate to convict, I think, which is below the 67 needed to convict. So I think it'll move a couple. Again,
Matthew, I think we lost your audio there real quick. I did want to try to take another question from Twitter and get folks engaged, but we'll get your audio back. And if we can get a couple more questions in for Matthew on the show, that'd be great. If not, I know he's also very active on Twitter, as am I. So let's move on in our conversation because we do have another guest I want to get to as well. There we go. Matthew, do we have you back? Awesome. Matthew, do we have you back? So I did have a final question for you. All right, Matthew, I think you froze again. I thank you so much for joining us, Matthew. Again, folks, questions that you have, hashtag Ask the Lincoln Report. Of course, you can also tweet directly at Matthew and myself, and we'll continue this conversation. This is important to have. But I want to get to also the remaining part of our conversation, which goes a little bit to history and our next guest.
Our destiny offers not the cup of despair, but the chalice of opportunity.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I've spoken of 1,000 points of light, of all the community organizations that are spread like stars throughout the nation doing good.
Bill Clinton and Al Gore represent the most pro-lesbian and pro-gay ticket in history.
Our top political priority over the next 2 years should be to deny President Obama a second term.
Are you a birther, Donald?
Something on that birth certificate that he doesn't like.
Oh my God.
Let them call you racist.
Nancy Pelosi is guilty of treason and we want her out.
They'll disarm you, empty the prisons, lock you in your home, and invite MS-13 to live next door.
You don't concede when there's theft involved.
You can't allow it to just transfer power peacefully.
The best is yet to come.
Well, the Republican Party used to pride itself on sobriety. Phrases like fiscal responsibility and family values were used to convey stability to a nation racked by assassinations, political unrest, and unpopular wars. Guess what? It worked. From 1968 until 1992, the GOP, with just one exception, won historic landslides for the presidency, and moderate voters embraced the Republican Party, my parents included. But as conservatism expanded into the mainstream, the GOP was nursing a paranoid base. And as the center shifted to the right and the right embraced the fringe, the groundwork was laid for a candidate unbound by any sense of responsibility to truth or decency, and indifferent to the use of violence as a means to gain power. Perhaps you know of whom we speak. These days, the GOP is the party of Trump, the alt-right, and QAnon. Donald Trump's willingness to abuse the presidency by stirring up his unhinged base makes the modern GOP synonymous with the kind of violent conspiracy fever dreams more in line with the Manson family than with one of America's two great political parties. Which brings us to this question: what is the GOP? And how is today's impeachment trial a defining moment? Here to talk about this moment of inflection is historian Rick Perlstein. He's author of, among other books, The Invisible Bridge and Reaganland. Rick?
Yes.
I hope we have you.
Here I am.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us, Rick. All right. First question. How did we get here?
Well, of course.
How did a party that is focused on, how does a party focused on small government and fiscal conservatism, fighting communism, end up creating record deficits and becoming deferential to Putin's Russia?
Well, of course, the first guy to pile up a record deficit was Ronald Reagan, and that came from, his tax cuts and this idea of trickle-down economics, right? The idea that tax cuts are going to miraculously create so much prosperity that taxes will flow into the public coffers and they won't have to cut anything at all. In a lot of ways, that's an idea that's just as empirically sound as, QAnon. It's just this made-up theory, right? And, the Republican Party doubled down on it, right? They've been nursing in their bosom a base of demagoguery, at least ever since the McCarthy era. In 1950, Joseph McCarthy, facing a re-election in 1952, said that the reason all the countries in Eastern Europe had gone communist was a conspiracy so vast to dwarf any in the history of mankind. The conspiracy was the idea that communists had infiltrated the government, right? And the Republicans were perfectly happy to embrace this idea as long as it helped them win elections. But then by 1954, he kind of went too far, much as Trump did, and they sought to distance themselves from him. And then in 1964, they nominated a candidate, Barry Goldwater, who had just voted against the Civil Rights Act, right? Voted against a law that would have prevented people from being banned from, sitting at lunch counters. Would have banned white and black restrooms. And when he won that nomination, one of his delegates from Texas said, we just moved the Mason-Dixon line clear up to Canada. So this has been a long time coming, right? But there's always been this kind of saving remnant in the Republican Party of this respectable establishment group of people who've kind of tolerated the demagogues because they helped them achieve power, the Bush family, right? In 2003, when George Bush got us into Iraq, he was perfectly happy to mobilize the anti-Muslim sentiment from 9/11, but he also said Islam is a religion of peace. But then when he faced, of course, a re-election in 2004, the Republican National Committee sent out mailers to voters in Arkansas and West Virginia saying that the Democrats were going to ban the Bible. They put anti-gay marriage initiatives on ballots all over the states. So there's always been this kind of precarious balance between almost Trump-like demagoguery in the Republican Party and this attempt to kind of be respectable. And, with Trump, Frankenstein created a monster and he's crashing around the forest and he can't be controlled.
There's two parts I want to get to. Let's do the paranoid base and the conspiracies first. As you mentioned, the GOP's bosom, they've been nursing them. Is there a line between, say, the John Birch societies or the Birchers to QAnon on the conspiracy spectrum?
Well, I mean, a much more dangerous conspiracy theory than QAnon was the conspiracy theory that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, right? It got us into a war that destroyed American foreign policy, led to maybe 1 million civilian deaths, has caused, more terrorism in the Middle East instead of less, right? So, it's been all over the place, right? The line has always been there. And suddenly the establishment woke up and they realized that they couldn't control this monster that they've created, this Pandora's box that they were perfectly happy to open as long as it helped them gain power.
The language, though, matters in how these issues are discussed. And so you mentioned in some of your writing about the post-Goldwater era, right? The transformation from overt violence towards Black people to this subtle language of stable housing, quality local education.
Colorblind conservatism.
It's been very difficult, though. Right. And it's very difficult, though, for people to accept that this color line conservatism is the new racism. So talk a bit about that, because it's not violent as people are taught to expect racism to be.
Right. One of the things that happened, because the civil rights movement and the reaction against it was so nasty and so violent, and, the public kind of came around to the idea that African Americans, deserve, equality and dignity. Right? You couldn't kind of say this stuff out loud. And, one of Reagan's key strategists, Lee Atwater, in 1981, in an interview very famously said, you can't use the N-word anymore, but we've, kind of figured out this way to kind of use code words, high taxes, welfare, right? And of course, in the case of Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign, which, started in Neshoba, Mississippi, right down the street from where 3 civil rights workers were lynched in 1964, the code word of states' rights. And, these things have consequences. There's a very straight line between, weaponizing an idea like states' rights or, bringing into the bosom of the Republican Party a figure like Jerry Falwell, who would say things like a homosexual will just as soon kill you as look at you, to, a guy going down an escalator and saying, Mexico is sending their rapists, but some of them are nice people.
I'm going to take a question from Twitter so that our viewers can participate. So folks, again, hashtag Ask the Lincoln Report. Here is a tweet now. Let me see what we can bring up from one of our viewers.
I didn't know I need to bring my reading glass.
I will read it for you. Don't you worry. I have been reading about splinter parties from the individuals leaving the Republican Party. We may know some of those. How do you think that will affect the success of the current party legislators in the future? So splinter parties, third parties, success of legislation writ large.
It's very tricky to organize outside the two-party system. The two parties have pretty well kind of erected a monopoly for themselves. There's all kinds of barriers to getting on the ballot. And when it looks like a third party is going to have some success, they raise the barriers higher. That happened in Arizona when the Libertarian Party was going strong in the 1980s and the 1990s. So what I kind of predict is we'll probably be in a situation like in the 60s and the 70s when the Republican Party really only had half of Congress and the Democratic Party was dominant.
All right, let's do another tweet here, see if we can pull one up from one of our viewers. All right, well, if we can't get a tweet, don't worry, Rick, I'll read for you. All right, it's coming up just one minute. There we go. All right. From S. Rush. Does the Republican leadership feel they have to continue to dog whistle on racism because they have no economic policies that will actually help the working class base, and imagine superiority is all they have to offer? I believe that is a rhetorical question, Rick, but feel free to expound on it.
It's a fascinating one. One of the reasons Ronald Reagan was so successful in the 1980 election was, when Jimmy Carter was saying we need more austerity, we need to sacrifice, Ronald Reagan was able to say tax cuts were going to make everyone more prosperous, right? He was able to promise prosperity. And, that came a cropper. It was a fantasy, right? And, but they stuck with it, right? I mean, when Bob Dole was the nominee in 1996, this epitome of the Republican establishment, he was kind of forced to run on this platform for a 10% across the board tax cut. And, there was just not enough credibility that made any sense, right? So he lost. And, this idea that tax cuts would solve all our problems was really the only arrow that Republicans, had in their quiver. And we've been dealing with, going on 50 years of stagnating wages for ordinary working class Americans. Whenever there's a Democrat in office, the economy does better, jobs do better. Whenever there's a Republican in office, basically they leave office with smoking ruins and the Democrat has to clean up for them, which actually was kind of part of the program. One of the big Republican conservative intellectuals in 1980, Irving Kristol, said, well, we should run up deficits and the Democrats will have to clean up, when they're in office, right? So it was kind of like Dick Cheney's idea that, Reagan-proof deficits didn't matter. Basically that can be for the Democrats to clean up afterwards. So yeah, the Republican Party hasn't had a credible economic agenda. So kind of squeezing out these kind of cultural resentments, often based in racism, was the only thing they had. And of course, diminishing returns. There's less and less reactionary old people that are willing to vote for that kind of thing. So all we have left is basically violent insurrection.
I want to read you then a quote from the current GOP chairperson, right, Ronna McDaniel. This is what she said in the Washington Post. If he, meaning Donald Trump, forms a third party, he would be letting down the 74 million people who supported him. Just like if the Senate convicts him, the Republicans who vote for it will be letting down the 74 million who supported the President Trump and the Republican Party. So if the Republican Party continues then to appease this Trump wing, does another party emerge? Like, what does this tell us about what we can expect from the Republican Party? And please, of course, draw on history to give us your crystal ball of the future.
Well, you're quoting a woman who, is so shameless and in bed with Trump that she literally gave up her last name, which was Romney, because, she didn't want to, offend, the Orange King, right? So the Romney family is a really fascinating example. George Romney was the governor of Michigan, and he had been a car executive who took on Detroit for its gas guzzlers, right? And he had been a very liberal governor. He marched with Martin Luther King. He ran for president, criticizing the Vietnam War. And then when Mitt Romney first announced his presidency in 2004, it was very interesting. He gave a speech calling for electric cars and less fossil fuels, kind of very much in his dad's kind of progressive tradition. But, that no longer played in the Republican Party, right? So he had to kind of like make his hard right, he had to make a hard right turn towards global warming denying when he ran for president. And then he also, we remember that Donald Trump, of course, rose to power on the birther conspiracy theory. Even Mitt Romney, when he was running for president, said, well, no one ever had to ask for my birth certificate. So he kind of dipped his toe in that water too. This is this dynamic I'm talking about, that Republicans have always been willing to kind of weaponize this kind of demagogic rhetoric. Now a figure like Mitt Romney is like, wow, he has the most progressive child allotment policy, right? It's more progressive than the Biden administration's. So that's the very cheering. So you have a battle between, a Republican Party of Mitt Romney, who now realizes that the kind of Reaganite Republican economic policies brought nothing but ruin, and this kind of nihilistic, conspiratorial John Birch Society style Trump wing. And anyone who, veers from it one iota, even if it's, a sycophant like Vice President Pence, suddenly finds themselves, part of the deep state. I don't know what happens next.
Well, we'll certainly be watching, and I think not just my eyes, but many eyes are on Mitt Romney as he stares at Josh Hawley. It's a great photo that really encapsulates how the impeachment hearings have been going today. Rick, thank you so much for joining us. Folks, please do check out his books. The latest is Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980. It's on sale at your local bookstore, and they could use your support. As we all know, today opening arguments began in the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump. The House managers who are prosecuting the case have been brought legal firepower and facts on their side. But this isn't about the merits of their case. Nope. In the end, the only thing that matters is a number, 67, 2/3 of the Senate. And that means convincing Republican senators to vote against Trump, their leader, dear leader in exile. He's still exceedingly popular with Republican voters. The vast majority of elected Republicans are afraid of Trump, even Twitterless Trump, and they're especially afraid of his loyal base. The sad fact is that this vote is a foregone conclusion. Even though the case to convict is strong, the insurrection was televised, and every single juror witnessed the crime with their own eyes. Even the president's allies recognized the weakness of the case. But the Republican Party, just 1 month shy of its 167th birthday, is now fully the party of Trump. They are giving voice to white identity politics, and with that, permission to express both racism and violence. The elected leadership has made what amounts to a deal with the devil. They can keep their jobs if they ignore the body count. Only time will tell which senators will stand up for the truth and where the Republican Party goes next. Like you, we'll be watching. Thanks for being with us tonight. I said it earlier and it bears repeating. We want to hear from you. So tweet us at the hashtag #AskTheLincolnReport. Tell us, what do you think is important? What do you want to know more about as we try to figure out how we move forward together? Tune into our show again on Friday, and please check out the other shows on Lincoln Project TV. The Breakdown airs Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9 p.m. And We're Speaking actually airs tonight, just a few minutes from now at 9 o'clock Eastern. That's it for now. And we always want to leave you with something a little extra. You saw the video of the Texas lawyer who couldn't get the cat filter off of his secretary's computer. Well, today, Minnesota Republican Congressman Tom Emmer appeared to be stuck upside down in the middle of his House Financial Services Committee meeting in Washington, D.C. Be careful out there in cyberspace, everyone. And good night from the Lincoln Report.
Today's gig economy sprung out from the last recession. It offers a job to anyone who wants one. During COVID-19, we must make sure that our nation's sole proprietors and the smallest of small businesses receive timely...
Will the gentleman suspend? I'm sorry, Mr. Emmer?
Yes.
Are you okay?
I am.
You're upside down, Tom.
I don't know how to fix that.
Would someone assist Mr. Emmer in getting right side up?
What's that?
Yeah, Madam Chair, hat?
Is this a metaphor?
I don't know, but it's upside down.